Hi, I'm Rose Aguilar. You're listening to the Authoritarian Playbook, a special series from KALW Public Media. During the 2024 election, we aired Project 2025 that explored the Heritage Foundation's far-right plan for a potential second Trump presidency. Throughout the campaign, the Trump team distanced themselves from Project 2025 and claimed they knew nothing about it. But the Trump administration is now packed with Project 2025 architects. Our new series, The Authoritarian Playbook, looks at how the administration is moving with unprecedented speed to turn Project 2025 into a reality that is fundamentally reshaping the United States government. Every week, we'll summarize the latest developments, put them in historical context, and find out how people and organizations are responding. One note before we begin. When this show originally aired live on KALW, listeners were encouraged to call in. If you have a comment or perspective to share about this series, please email authoritarianplaybook@kalw.org. Today, we continue our new series, The Authoritarian Playbook. Today, we're discussing the long-lasting impacts of DOGE with the nation's Sasha Abramsky, author of the new book, American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and DOGE butchered the U.S. government. You might remember that at the 2025 Conservative Political Action Conference, Elon Musk, then the head of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, as it was called, took to the stage holding a chainsaw that was given to him by Argentine President Javier Milei. The chainsaw was used by Milei during his 2023 presidential campaign to symbolize his plan to shred government bloat. Elon Musk said he would do the same to the so-called deep state. DOGE resulted in the firings, buyouts, layoffs, resignations, and retirements of over 300,000 federal workers, more than 10% of the federal workforce. Sasha Abramsky delivers a powerful account of the stories of 11 of those workers across 8 government agencies, from the time they were fired through the summer of last year in what he calls a cascading tragedy of historic proportions. He writes, "Their stories are America's stories. What happened to them, the bullying, intimidation, the denigration of character, and the deliberate removal of financial stability also happened to hundreds of thousands of other employees. The administration took a chainsaw to everything from disease prevention to basic environmental research, from preschool programs and enforcement of civil rights laws to crime victim services and food safety inspections. The pain they felt is one mirrored by the pain and the shock experienced by people in the U.S. denied access to services once taken for granted, as retirees stand in line for hours at understaffed Social Security offices to try to access benefits they've paid into their entire working lives, as consumers cheated by large financial institutions realize they no longer have advocates in their corner, as survivors of the World Trade Center attacks have their healthcare services curtailed, as veterans are denied access to mental health and substance abuse services, as the homeless find even fewer federal resources directed their way. So too, it is a pain felt by desperately impoverished men, women, and children overseas whose lives were once made better, even if just at the margins, by organizations such as USAID, and who now are left having to find ways to survive in a landscape from which America has decided to absent itself. So what does the future hold for these federal agencies and the employees and the services that have experienced so much damage at the hands of DOGE? Sasha Abramsky is Western correspondent and columnist for The Nation magazine. He teaches writing at UC Davis and is the author of 11 books, including his latest, American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. Hi, Sasha. Thank you so much for this important book, and thank you for joining us.
Rose, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's always great to have you on, Sasha. I want to ask you a big question before we dive in. Reading your book and thinking about these issues made me think about an interview that M. Gessen, who is a columnist with the New York Times and was a journalist in Russia, gave to NPR in August of 2025. And she said, "In 7 months, Donald Trump has done to the United States what it took Putin a decade to do in Russia. And what strikes me about the guests that we've had on our Authoritarian Playbook series, Sasha, is these are people who study authoritarian regimes around the world, and they say that they just had no idea things would move so quickly. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I'm writing a new column for The Nation now called Authoritarian Watch. So I've been thinking a lot about these exact issues, and I've been talking to a lot of scholars of authoritarianism, to legal advocates, to trade union advocates. And so many of these men and women are telling me that this is happening at a startling speed. And they mention Putin, they mention Erdogan in Turkey, they mention Orban in Hungary, and Modi in India. Those are the sort of comparison leaders. And they all say that Trump is demolishing democratic safeguards at a faster speed than these other authoritarian leaders were able to do. Now, that doesn't mean that it's going to continue, because there's tremendous pushback. We're seeing that pushback in Minneapolis. We're seeing it in Chicago. We're seeing it in Portland, Los Angeles, in all of the areas of the country where Trump is really sort of putting boots on the ground in the most literal of ways. The pushback has been magnificent, and it's been profound. And I do think there is probably a difference between the United States and Russia in that our civic society is much more vibrant and dynamic than was the case in the post-Soviet system in Russia or in some of the other satellite states of the ex-Soviet Union. But I do think it is a warning sign that all of the safeguards that, a year ago people said, well, the Supreme Court will hold or Congress will hold, all of those are breaking down. And, this ties in very much with my book project, with the American Carnage book, because part of DOGE's project, a large part of DOGE's mandate, was to shatter the independence of the professional civil service. It's like the old Roman strategy that if a military unit lost a battle, 1 in 10 of the soldiers would then be killed as an example to the other 9 in 10 to do better next time. And it's kind of like that with DOGE. They got rid of 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 of the federal workers. They fired them with no advance notice, in many cases 2-3 hours notice, and they were frog marched out of their buildings by US Marshals. And the reason they did that was it terrified the survivors. So if you were not DOGed, if you somehow remained in your job in the winter and spring of last year, you were that much more likely to do whatever illegal or unethical or immoral acts you were ordered to do by the higher-ups in the Trump administration, because you were terrified that you in turn would be fired, you in turn would not be able to pay your mortgage, and you in turn would have no health insurance. And I think that is a large part of the DOGE project. It's softened up the civil service for the much broader authoritarian onslaught on American democracy.
And as you point out in your book, American Carnage, none of this cruelty was incidental. Rather, it was the main point. You write, the federal government, the largest employer in the country, has decided that its workers were the enemy within. Indeed, Russell Vought, architect of Project 2025 and Trump's choice to head up the Office of Management and Budget, was on record as saying he wanted federal employees to be traumatically affected. A month before the election, ProPublica released a video recording of Russell Vought saying of the workers, when they wake up in the morning, we want them to not want to go to work because they're increasingly viewed as the villains. We want their funding to be shut down. We want to put them in trauma. And as you point out, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah, I mean, this is an absolutely insane mandate for the federal government to implement. They basically said we have 2 million federal workers here. We have public servants who work in healthcare. We have people who work on veterans affairs. We have fire service people. We have people working on workplace protections. We have people working on environmental issues, education, you name it. All of these men and women have suddenly been transformed from being public civil servants to being the enemy within, who can be traumatized at whim, tormented at whim by Elon Musk and his acolytes. And so Russell Vought had this sort of very explicit idea, we're going to put federal workers into trauma. And he did. Elon Musk came in, they started making these sort of crazy mandates. You have to come back to work, but when you come back to work, the cubicles you work in aren't functioning, or the bathrooms you needed in your office aren't functioning. You have to report back to work every week and say to Elon Musk, here are 5 things I did that justify my continued employment. But for hundreds of thousands of those workers, they weren't even being allowed into their offices because they'd been placed on administrative leave. And yet they still had to do these 5 things to keep me employed. It was just designed to torment workers. It was the same strategy that Elon Musk used when he came into Twitter, or renamed it X, and he wanted to fire a large part of his workforce. He came in and he deliberately made their working conditions unendurable. So this was a deliberate strategy that Russell Vogt had theorized about, and then Elon Musk and his tech bro henchmen came in and implemented. And what happened was DOGE was created outside of all congressional authority. Congress didn't create it. Congress didn't fund it. Congress didn't approve the appointment of Elon Musk. This was a sort of shadow government that was created in the first days of the Trump administration, and its input was designed to hack the government systems. So these young men, usually from the Ivy Leagues or from Cal Berkeley or from some of these other top institutions, these young tech bros came in with a mandate for Elon Musk to hack the informational pipelines and the financial pipelines that held government together, and to break down all of the segmentations that traditionally meant that you only had information on a need-to-know basis. So suddenly you have all these young guys with no understanding of the Constitution or of the law, breaking down all of these limits on how information is used and accessed, and then using that information to fire people just wholesale. So hundreds of thousands of people are either fired in January, February, March of last year, or their life work conditions are made so unendurable that they're pushed to take these buyouts, what Elon Musk called the fork in the road, or they're pushed into early retirement. And the result was calamitous. You saw lines soaring at Social Security offices. You saw civil rights laws no longer being enforced. At the Department of Justice, you had a breakdown of the anti-corruption units and anti-corruption investigations. At every level of government, apart from the national security state, with ICE and the CPB and the other agencies that are sort of increasingly made up Trump's secret police. But with that exception, all of these other layers and levels of government were deliberately shredded by Musk in his sort of manic efforts to shrink government and to deliver utterly unrealizable cost savings that Trump's urging.
Sasha, I wonder how your thoughts about government were affected doing this research and writing this book, because I think about the decades of conservatives and Republicans just bashing government. Ronald Reagan said the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And then you have the anti-tax, anti-regulation conservative Grover Norquist saying that he wanted to reduce the size of the government until it was small enough to be drowned in the bathtub. And so a lot of people do not like government for a variety of reasons. And reading the introduction, I was thinking, I wonder if some of our listeners might be thinking, well, the government is bloated. Maybe these people should have lost their jobs. So I just wonder what your thoughts are on this, because a lot of people don't really know how government works or what these people do.
Yeah, my thoughts are on this, that there is government bloat. There has always been government bloat, but that's not unique to the public sector. There's also bloat in private institutions too. You can trim bloat without deliberately sabotaging the function of government. And you can trim bloat without deliberately humiliating the individuals who have dedicated their lives to public service in government. Look, I'm not a fan of the military-industrial complex. We spend more, I believe, than the next 7 biggest militaries combined on our military. To me, that's an absurd waste of money. But there are other parts of government that are extraordinarily important. Look, if you're a farmer and you want to know about the weather forecast, the extended weather forecast, so that you know how to plant crops, you need a functioning NOAA, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. But the NOAA was targeted by Trump and by Elon Musk because part of the work that it did was investigating climate research, climate change. And Trump is ideologically opposed to anything connected to climate change research. And so they shredded NOAA, and thousands of workers were either fired or placed on administrative leave. The same thing with USAID. For years and years and years, conservatives have said, well, we're spending up to 25% of our federal budget on overseas aid. That was always a nonsense. We never, even in the best years, we never spent more than 1% of our budget on overseas aid. And the thing about USAID was it was a $40 billion investment in soft power. Because what USAID did was it created an infrastructure around the world to distribute medicines that could bring people back from the brink of starvation. It distributed medications around HIV/AIDS and tuberculosis and malaria. It distributed vaccines for diseases like polio. It saved millions of lives a year. And in doing so, it engendered a tremendous amount of global goodwill, because people all over the world could look at the world's greatest superpower and they could say, all right, this isn't a country that just projects hard power. This isn't a country that just dominates through military prowess, but it's also a country with a big heart. It's a country that's willing to send resources and willing to send expertise out to places all over the world to help people in need. And that $40 billion investment generated a marvelous return. And Trump and Musk came in and they said, we can no longer afford USAID. Well, that was a nonsense. Elon Musk at the time was worth about $500 billion. I did some back of the envelope calculations. The amount of money it cost to save one child from starvation through giving them a medication called Plumpy Nut is about $50. Elon Musk could have given up 1 day of his income, not 1 month, not 1 year, but 1 day of his income in January or February of 2025. And that would have been enough to distribute 12 million children's doses of Plumpy Nut. That's an extraordinary calculus. But Trump and Musk came in and they said, we can no longer afford overseas aid. So I think, when conservatives are saying big government is bloated, these people don't deserve to be working in government, you've got to look at what you're talking about. You're not talking about things in the abstract. You're talking about real people doing real public service. You're talking about real people who need those public services, both domestically and overseas, all of whom are losing out in this new calculus. They're getting fewer public services. They're waiting longer in lines to access Social Security or Medicare or the IRS if they have a question. They're not getting money for their bang for their buck anymore. And hundreds of thousands of federal workers had their life security utterly upended and their families' life securities utterly upended. And these were real people. I mean, one of the most moving stories for me is a middle-aged woman who was working for NOAA, a woman called Natasha Miles, who I interviewed. And she was a probationary employee. She was a new hire. She'd come from academia. She was a very skilled climate researcher. And she gets a job in Boulder, Colorado at the NOAA offices. And she drives out west to take the new job. And at 2:30 that afternoon, when she's an hour outside of Boulder, she gets a call saying her new job is being terminated at 5 p.m. that day. I mean, this is a woman who literally upended her life to take a job in public service. And that is the way the government treated her.
So she's 53 years old. She's an atmospheric scientist whose specialty involved taking and interpreting intricate measurements for urban carbon dioxide and methane emissions. This is such important work, and yet a lot of people don't really know what is involved in this and why it is so important.
Well, this is right. When government works properly, we don't tend to know about it. It just helps things click as normal. It's only when government doesn't work properly that we start realizing we maybe need some of those services. So an example is all of these extreme weather events that we've been having recently. And you have hurricanes, you have these massive winter storms, you have droughts in the American West. But now you have a non-functional disaster relief system because FEMA has been utterly eviscerated. So when disaster strikes, there are less federal resources. Now, the thing about a country the scale of America, we pool our resources. If something happens in California, there are resources that can be used from the East Coast or from the South. If a hurricane hits in the South, the same thing. There are resources that can be brought to bear from all over this continental country. But if you break down that federal system, if you say, all right, these federal agencies are no longer going to function, suddenly things stop working as smoothly. So if you are hit by a natural disaster, you don't get relief from the government as quickly, financial relief. You don't get rebuilding as quickly. You don't get disaster relief agencies coming in to monitor pollution. All of that stuff that used to just be background is no longer happening in the Trump era because so many parts of the government are starting to break down. And that's a tragedy. And that's going to be a tragedy that is with us for decades, because when that many people with expertise are removed from the federal government, they don't come back. They find jobs somewhere else, whether it's in state government or academia or the private sector, or increasingly overseas. And we're seeing this extraordinary brain drain at the moment where some of America's top talent are going to Canada, to Europe, to Australia. They're going anywhere but here because all these other countries are accepting and welcoming their expertise. And in America, their expertise is mocked.
On today's Authoritarian Playbook series, we're spending the hour with the nation's Sasha Abramsky, who's out with a new book, American Carnage: How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. He follows the stories of 11 of the over 300,000 federal workers who were fired, laid off, or offered buyouts by DOGE. Sasha, we're going to spend time talking about the people that you interviewed, but I want to ask you another broader question here. I think about Steve Bannon famously saying we need to flood the zone with SHIT. And we have such a crazy media system now. I mean, you can live in a very different world than your neighbor. So there's that. And then there's COVID. And so many people started to really distrust and even hate the government during COVID. I think about the MAHA movement. I don't know if people in the MAHA movement have talked about how DOGE has affected the things that they claim to care about, make America healthy again. But these are people who also say, we just need to blow it all up and start over again. And you could argue that Trump may have won because of some of those people. What do you say to them?
I think you're right. Trump probably did win because of those people. There was tremendous uneasiness in the country after COVID. There was a tremendous breakdown in trust in institutions of power and expertise. And Trump ruthlessly exploited that. And Steve Bannon ruthlessly exploited it. And you quote Steve Bannon's strategy, which is basically to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the media, so the media is overwhelmed and doesn't really know how to report it. And that's been a governing strategy for the last more than a year, where every day there's a new act of chaos. Every day there's a new breakdown of a constitutional norm. Every day there's another thing that should in and of itself be the headline for its sheer authoritarianism or its corruption or its illegality or its immorality. But it all gets lost in the mix. But a lot of people were willing to tolerate Trump's chaos. A lot of people were willing to tolerate Trump's cruelty because they believed that he was going to shake everything up. Now, my previous book was called Chaos Comes Calling, and it was published just before the 2024 election. And it was about exactly that scenario. People who had been radicalized by the pandemic, they'd gone down the rabbit hole over vaccines. They believed that vaccines were a conspiracy. They believed that the lockdowns were a conspiracy. They didn't believe any public health data. And they were absolutely convinced that unless they sort of embraced this hard right political package, they were going to lose their liberties. And the thing is, it was always a myth. And Trump fed on that myth. Trump is a masterful demagogue. He knows how to sort of really, really precisely hone in on people's fears and anxieties and exploit those fears and anxieties for his own political ends. Now, realistically, if you look at the last year, I struggle to see how anybody can honestly say Trump is making America a healthier, kinder, better place. He's put armed troops into the center of cities. He's terrorizing entire communities. He's unleashed rampant corruption at the highest levels of government. He's politicized the DOJ, so it's going after his political enemies in an absolutely unprecedented manner, in a manner that is far more reminiscent of Putin's Russia than of anything in the American democratic experience. He's rolling back 60 years of civil rights law and 60 years of civil rights protections. He's inverting the civil rights division to be an enforcer of white power and white privilege, and to basically turn on its head the civil rights arguments that were designed to protect traditionally marginalized and vulnerable and exploited groups. All of that stuff is going on in broad daylight. There's no mystery to it. There's no secret to it. If you look at the words of Hegseth or Kristi Noem or Stephen Miller or Vance or Trump or any of the other inner circle, you hear and see white nationalism on a daily basis. And you hear and see authoritarianism on a daily basis. I don't think in a country this diverse, this multi-ethnic, this pluralistic, anybody can honestly say that that vision makes the country better or kinder or fairer or gentler. It doesn't. But until that MAGA cult is broken, you're going to have an awful lot of people basically twisting themselves into pretzels to try and justify the morally unjustifiable around Donald Trump.
On today's Authoritarian Playbook series, we are spending the hour with the nation's Sasha Abramsky. We're talking about his new book, American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. We'll be back after this. Today, we continue our series, The Authoritarian Playbook, discussing the Trump administration's authoritarian actions and policies. Like you, we just can't keep up. So every week, we'll summarize the latest news, put it in historical context, and find out how people are or are not responding. We are speaking with the nation's Sasha Abramsky about his new book, American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. He writes about 11 of the over 300,000 federal workers who were fired, laid off, or offered buyouts by DOGE. He explores the human cost of this damage to the workers, but also to the social services. What is going to happen? Is it possible to rebuild this? How is the next Democratic presidential candidate going to be talking about this? Before the break, Sasha, you were talking about how people were willing to forgive Trump for certain things. There are racists in this country who actually like what he's doing. That has come out because of his election. And Ted writes, can you please talk about the way that the right has used anti-government rhetoric as a dog whistle to promote racism against government workers who happen to be people of color? And we should say a lot of Black women lost their jobs because of DOGE. And then Ted writes, the Mamdani victory shows a positive development, a vote of confidence for government as a tool to lift folks up.
Yeah, so, I mean, answering the question about racism, DOGE was always skewed against Black women in particular. Hundreds of thousands of Black women left the United States workforce in 2025. And we don't have an exact breakdown of how many of those were federal workers, but a goodly number were. There's been a massive rollback of the African-American middle class under Trump's presidency. And it's hard to see that as being an accident, because if you look at Trump's rhetoric, if you look at the sort of monomaniacal focus against diversity, and you look at this idea that DEI somehow sort of put the country on the wrong track and we have to go back to this sort of purer time. It's a nostalgia for a whiter America. It's a nostalgia for an America where there was a racial and class hierarchy that was understandable to people like the young Donald Trump, or his father, Fred Trump, who was in the KKK in the 1920s. So I think that there has been this sort of extreme reversion to the uglier impulses in American history, and that Trump is sort of putting that on steroids at the moment. And we are seeing rollbacks of civil rights expectations that would have been unimaginable 5, 10, 15 years ago. So I think that's number one. But the idea that we are somehow creating a small government by doing this is an absolute illusion. I don't think there's been a US government in American history that is as big government or as big brother government as this administration has been. They are using a secret police, masked and unidentified, on the streets of American cities. They're using secretive administrative subpoenas against their political opponents. They are using the DOJ to politically prosecute enemies. They are using the State Department to clamp down on free speech by deporting people not for criminal actions, but for things they have said and things they have written. This is not in any way, shape, or form a small government project. It is a deeply authoritarian, big government project. What it is doing is it's making the social parts of government smaller, the parts to do with healthcare, the parts to do with the environment, the parts to do with social and economic justice. It's making all of those parts of government smaller, and then it's turbocharging the security parts of the modern state. It's a complete reimagining of what the American political system is or should be. Now, coming on to the second question about Mamdani, look, we're seeing this all over the country. At a local level, people are absolutely angered and infuriated with what Trump's doing. And so they're responding in kind. We saw that in the elections in New York. We even saw it in the elections in a very conservative state district in Texas last week, where a Democrat overturned a 30-point Republican majority and ended up winning a state legislative seat. We're seeing pushback all over the country. And Trump knows that. And that's why Trump is doing everything he can to put his finger on the scales and impact the 2026 election. He's threatening to nationalize the election process. He's trying to seize voter rolls. Steve Bannon's talking about surrounding polling stations with ICE agents. They're doing everything they can to undermine the idea of a free and fair election in 2026, and everything they can to cast doubt on the results if they still lose that election. And that's shameful, because when you destroy the sort of understandings and common principles that underlie democracy, then you've got nothing left but brute force. And that destroys a 250-year project in America of moving toward a greater, more perfect democratic system. And Trump and Bannon and these others, they're doing everything they can to shred that history.
On that point, Sasha, that the New York Times has a piece today about the FBI seizing ballots and other 2020 voting records last week in Fulton County, Georgia. The DOJ has sued nearly half of the states in the country to try to obtain their full voter rolls with personal information to build a national voter database. This is getting a lot of media attention. How do you think people should be responding to this?
Keep your eyes on the prize. This is all about power. And the Republicans, led by Donald Trump, are doing everything they can to skew the system so that even if they lose the popular vote by a massive margin, they can try and eke out a congressional victory. They're trying to gerrymander at the state level with mid-decade redistricting. They're trying to gerrymander racially by pushing back against what's left of the Voting Rights Act. And it looks like the Supreme Court is going to side with them on that. They're trying to inject the military and National Guard and ICE into domestic elections, and they're trying to intimidate people away from voting. So if you know that Trump and his acolytes don't want you to vote, don't fall for it. If you have the right to vote, vote. Pay attention to what's happening, listen to the news, listen to the stories about all of these intrusions on the electoral process, and then draw your own conclusions about what this means for American democracy and what Trump thinks about democracy.
Well, thank you for the email, Ted. We did a show about Zoran Mamdani's historic New York City mayoral victory last week. You can find it at kalw.org and click news. We have a number of callers and emails coming in, Sasha. So let's take some callers and then we'll go to emails. Let's go to Parker in San Francisco. Hi, Parker. Thanks for holding.
Hi there. Thanks for having me on, and thank you, Sasha, for all the work that you've been doing on this. I guess my question is, in your reporting, you've probably been talking to a lot of people who also are in support of these cuts, who believe that this is necessary, as you said, just to shake up the system. And I kind of wonder, your perspective on the longer history of that idea. I think in the American context, a lot of people are and have historically been distrustful of federal government, of state government, of any government where they can't just, be doing their own human farming or whatever. And I'm kind of just wondering your perspective on that, continuing into the present day. Obviously, I feel like it's good that we're talking about what this administration is going in so far as to do to be corrupt, but I'm just kind of concerned, frankly, about how long of a tendency this has been in many Americans to want to support exactly this kind of administration. And frankly, a lot of the moves that this administration is doing. So thank you again for your work and your time.
Thank you so much, Parker.
Parker, I appreciate your comments, and I think it's a really interesting question. Look, for many, many years, decades, maybe longer, there's been a strand of American politics that doesn't like expansive government. And that's fair enough. You can have that political argument. You can say government's too big. We don't think the federal state should be expanded like this. We think more power should reside with states, or whatever it might be. That's fair enough. But then be consistent. If you don't like big government, you shouldn't like the massive expansion of ICE and of the CPB. If you don't like big government, you certainly shouldn't like the national security surveillance state that Trump and Musk and the others have created. If you don't like big government, you should be extraordinarily worried about the fact that Elon Musk and the tech bros who went in with DOGE in 2025 accessed all of our personal information. They access social security data, healthcare data, immigration data, education data, housing data. All of that information has been brought together in these massive databases by DOGE. So if you don't like big government, you should be absolutely horrified by the direction that Trump is taking the country. And I think that that's a political debate we're going to be having in the next few years, because I think there are people on the right, people like Rand Paul, for example, who are beginning to get really, really uncomfortable with some of the power grabs that the Trump administration is now making.
And to Parker's point about Trump voters, as you said, your last book is Chaos Comes Calling, the battle against the far-right takeover of small-town America. You told parallel stories of two communities, Shasta County up in Northern California and Sequim, Washington, where you had QAnoners, anti-vaxxers, Christian nationalists, militia supporters. Are you still in touch with some of these Trump supporters? And can you give us any insights into what they're thinking about where we are right now?
So the answer is I'm not currently in touch with the people I interviewed in Sequim and in Shasta County. But I did spend a lot of time talking with them in 2023 and 2024. And, they were, fascinating. I didn't agree with a lot of what they said. I didn't agree with most of what they said. A lot of them had gotten politicized, as I said earlier, by the pandemic. This was something that turned people who were mildly conservative into people who were hyper-conservative and willing to organize around their conservatism. There were other issues in play that also sort of impacted them that weren't to do with the pandemic. There were cultural war issues around transgender identity that politicized an awful lot of people in small rural America. There were issues around gun ownership that brought a lot of people into politics. As I said, I did not agree with the people I was interviewing up there, but I found their worldview fascinating. And I think that you have to talk to people with a different worldview every so often in order to understand, where the country's heading. And it gave me an understanding in 2024 that it was by no means outside the bounds of the possible that Donald Trump would get reelected. And, I had that same sense in 2016 when I was interviewing people at Republican caucuses and in small towns in Nevada and other places. And it became very clear to me in 2016 that there was this thing percolating below the surface that a lot of the media was missing and a lot of the commentary was missing. And it was going to transform American politics in a way that I thought was profoundly dangerous. And I've spent much of the last 10 years wrestling with that reality that there are these undercurrents in American life that are fiercely conservative. And there are these undercurrents in American life that are really nativist and really hostile to the idea of immigration. And these different undercurrents all came together in the MAGA movement. They all came together in the person of Donald Trump. And we're living with the consequences today because Trump managed to thread a needle and he managed to create a coalition of these sort of improbable allies. So you have probably the most libertine president in American history who has these diehard supporters among the evangelical movement. These alliances that don't really make a whole bunch of sense, and yet they work for Donald Trump, and they've propelled him to the pinnacle of power twice, the second time after he'd been impeached twice. And I think that says a lot about where we are as a country right now.
We're getting a lot of emails, Sasha, from people who think that the media are still not rising to this moment. And you're reminding me of a show we did with these incredible librarians. Martha Hickson was one of the first librarians that came under fire by QAnoners and these hardline right-wingers. She said that she thinks that these people are in the extreme minority, but they're very loud. They come to meetings and they want to live in a white Christian nation. I still don't think many in the media know how to deal with this. What are your thoughts?
I think it's really extraordinarily difficult to deal with a movement like MAGA because it is fundamentally irrational. It does have conspiracy ideas at its core, and it has strategists like Steve Bannon who have realized that you can do a runaround around the traditional media. You can reach out directly to a public through social media in particular, and you can flood the zone. And you can flood the zone in a way that means that the journalists who are trying to cover this are always responding to five-alarm fires. And so there isn't really room for a consistent analysis because you try and stay on topic one day and suddenly the next day you're dealing with something else. So you want to focus on Minneapolis, but then suddenly we're worried about Trump invading Greenland. Or you want to focus on Greenland, but then you can't because Trump's talking about, sending the military in to seize ballot boxes in the 2026 elections. It becomes almost impossible to develop a sort of through line where you focus intensely on these key issues. I think the media is partly responsible for that. I do think there have been sort of editorial problems with how Trump has been covered. But I don't think it's just to do with media failings. I think that Trump and his surrounding henchmen are masterful propagandists. And they're extraordinarily successful demagogues. And when you have demagoguery and you have propaganda right at the core of power, it makes it really, really difficult to cover it accurately, honestly, and forcefully.
Well, and these days you have people who don't even believe the AP or Reuters. They think that, they're part of the deep state. I mean, I've seen things like AP, I don't trust them. So you've got people who don't trust the most mainstream outlets today and might get all of their news from a YouTube show. So we're just living in such a different media world.
We are. I mean, it's absolutely fragmented. And this is going to be an issue that's with us way beyond Trump. Trump's mortal. One day we will live in a post-Trump universe. But the phenomenon of a fractured news environment and the phenomenon of a world where a huge part of the population gets their information or misinformation from social media, and the phenomenon of living in a world where artificial intelligence makes it almost impossible to work out what's real and what's been generated fictively by AI. This is posing real challenges to the survivability of democracy. And it's not just an American problem. I mean, we sort of headline it at the moment because Donald Trump sucks all the oxygen out of the room. So no other country and no other leader really is getting much attention right now. But that same problem is going on all over the world, that it is increasingly difficult to circulate accurate information, and it's increasingly difficult to get even the basic consensus on what reality is. So we all live in our own sort of metaverses. We all live in our own realities these days. And we have our own echo chambers, and we have our own sources of information that may or may not be reliable, but it plays to our confirmation biases. And that makes doing democracy very, very difficult. Now, I do think we'll get beyond it. I think, eventually we will find ways to recalibrate in a way that does allow us to function democratically. But I think we're in that weird moment. And Gramsci talks about it. The old world is destroyed. The new world is not yet being born. Thus, we are in a time of monsters. And I think that's where we are now. We're in this sort of transitional period, and it's producing these diabolically awful political leaders.
We're getting a lot of questions about the Democrats. A listener writes, I'm not seeing much fight from the Democrats on a national level. It seems like they're lying low and hoping it will go back to business as usual. I do not think that's a good strategy. Ruby writes, Trump knows if he loses the House and Senate, he'll most likely be impeached. If he gets out of office, as he is rightfully destined to in 3 years, he'll be sentenced on 36 felonies. I ask, why did we all follow the rules with dignity and honor when he's scraping and clawing on his belly to undermine everything for his own good? Why and what now? Just a lot of questions saying, where are the Democrats?
I think those are all valid questions, that we are dealing with an absolutely abnormal presidency. We're dealing with an absolutely abnormal set of political priorities, and we're dealing with a leadership that is shameless and has no moral limits, and has made it clear it has no moral limits. It will defend the assassination of people on the streets and then smear the name of the victims. It will do things that are absolutely appalling, and it will do it again and again and again. And so it does necessitate a kind of pushback politics that's more assertive. And it necessitates a sort of all-hands-on strategy, a legal strategy where state attorneys general suing and suing and suing again, a grassroots strategy where millions of Americans are out on the streets in a non-violent form of resistance. You don't have to be a liberal to support that. David Brooks, who's one of the sort of doyens of conservative writing in this country, for several months now, David Brooks has been calling for a mass movement to protest Trumpism. And he says without that mass movement, we risk falling into authoritarianism for decades. So it's going to need not just senators making good speeches, not just governors making good speeches. It needs an all hands on moment to push back against authoritarianism. And I do think
what's wild about this moment, Sasha, is that you've got Republicans and former Republicans who speak with so much more passion than a lot of the Democratic politicians.
I mean, look, if you look at the last few years,
and I'm talking about anti-Trump Republicans.
No, I know. And you're right.
Yeah.
If you look at the last few years and you look at the sort of crafting of an anti-Trump narrative, Liz Cheney, who I was not a fan of, I didn't like most of her policies, but in articulating a message as to why Trump was bad, Liz Cheney was very effective. You can go on social media. You'll see a lot of never Trump Republicans who are sort of pushing a sort of five-alarm fire message saying, look, we can't afford to sit back because Trump threatens everything valuable in the American political project. Now, of course, there are many, many Democrats saying the same things. You don't have to go very far. You see it here in California with Gavin Newsom. You see it in Illinois with Governor Pritzker. You see an increasing number of senators and members of the House of Representatives willing to take a stand in a way that they just wouldn't have been a year ago. You see people willing to get arrested to protest ICE in a way they wouldn't have been a year ago. So I do think that, there is movement and the Democrats are being pushed into a more assertive response, but they're being pushed from the ground up. This is not a sort of natural position for the Democratic leadership to be in. They don't like being activists, but I think by force of circumstance, they're being pushed in that direction.
The Nation's Sasha Abramsky is out with a new book, American Carnage, How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. Let's take a few callers and emails, and then we'll get Sasha's final thoughts. Let's go to Kim in San Francisco. Hi, Kim. Thanks for holding.
Hi, Rose. This has been a fantastic conversation. Absolutely fantastic. Definitely how I see, and I'm sure many people see it. I want to ask the guests, because you guys were talking earlier about the data, and that's been one of the things that have given me anxiety. I can't sleep. This data, DOGE, and then now Christie Nome with the 700 boxes. I want to ask the guests, what's Fulton County? Is that a predominantly African-American county, or is it a mix?
It's a good question. I don't know the exact demographics of Fulton County, but I do know that for years and years, Trump's obsessed about it because he believes that it was in Fulton County that he lost the election in Georgia. And so because he can't admit he legitimately lost an election, he psychologically is incapable of admitting that. If he lost an election in Georgia, in Trump's mind, it must be because of fraud. And so he's going after Fulton County. He's decided that he's going to prosecute people. He said that again and again and again. There will be prosecutions. Well, that's not how the American justice system works. The president doesn't get to just decide we're going to prosecute somebody and then the DOJ dances to his tune. But that's what's happening at the moment with Pam Bondi in charge of the DOJ. Trump says prosecute, she jumps, she prosecutes. We saw this extraordinary thing in Fulton County where Tulsi Gabbard, the national intelligence chief, went down on the ground while the FBI agents were on the scene. And she then phoned Trump and connected with Trump and put Trump on the phone directly with the FBI agents. Well, that breaks every protocol you can possibly imagine that's designed to separate out the DOJ from political pressure. And the reason this is so significant is because if he did it in Fulton County regarding an election that happened nearly 6 years ago, you can bet your bottom dollar that they are prepping to do the same thing if they lose elections in key states in 2026. That what we saw in Fulton County was a dress rehearsal to try and intimidate elections officials all around the country during the midterm elections and the next presidential election.
And Fulton County is 43% Black, about 36% white, 8% Asian, 8% Latino. Thank you for calling in, Kim, and to talk about Fulton County and the plans that they have for the next election are so important. Sasha, in our remaining minutes, and we'd love to have you back because we really only scratched the surface on your book, and we'd like to talk more about the people that you actually write about. A lot of listeners are calling in saying, what do you think is most effective? An economic boycott? What are your thoughts?
Well, Rose, first of all, I'd love to come back and talk more about the book. I'd be delighted to. And in terms of the effective pushback, what I was saying earlier about a combination of things. So, last week, activists in Minneapolis called for a general strike around the country. Now, again, that's unimaginable in the American context that general strikes are now on the cards. But Robert Reich has been pushing for a general strike for the last few months. The activists on the ground in Minneapolis and in Chicago and other cities where ICE targeted, they've been calling for general strikes. So I think economic boycotts, a refusal to provide labor for this authoritarian project, is a key part of it. Non-cooperation at the local level is a key part of it. Talking to friends, neighbors, family members, work colleagues about this, refusing to put your head in the sand, that is a key part of it. And of course, voting, refusing to be intimidated by a movement that is trying to scare people away from the ballot box. Now, none of that by itself will be enough. All of it together will eventually undermine the MAGA movement and MAGA's claim on power.
Sasha Abramsky writes a column about authoritarianism for The Nation. His new book is called American Carnage: How Trump, Musk, and DOGE Butchered the U.S. Government. Sasha, thank you so much for your work. Thanks for joining us, and we'd love to have you back.
Always a pleasure, Rose. Thank you.
Thank you. You can find all of the articles and information we shared at kalw.org or in the episode notes. Thanks to Johanna Miyake for producing today's show and Kevin Vance for engineering our show. And thank you for joining us. Join us again next Monday to learn more about the latest from the administration's Authoritarian Playbook and find out how the public is responding. I'm Rose Aguilar. This is KALW San Francisco Bay Area.